I want to talk about Anaximander. And so Anaximander is someone who was likely, we hear, about 14 years younger than Thales. And so Thales is often regarded as the first philosopher. Anaximander may have been one of his students, one of his colleagues. We don't really know. The fact that we even have some idea of what's going on with respect to his dates is kind of interesting and is something of a historical accident. But nevertheless, we have reason to believe that Anaximander was a generation or maybe less from Thales in the same region, would have known him, and was apparently building upon and building from his philosophical ideas. Now that in itself points to a kind of tradition. So can we talk about the Milesian school of philosophy? This is often what we hear. Now, schools of philosophy, we don't really get the idea of schools of philosophy until later. And the idea that we had a Milesian school of philosophy is something that we hear from Theophrastus. I mean, this is many centuries later, so who knows what was really going on. But at the same time, Anaximander is someone that, yes, he probably was building from Thales, and it seems clear that he was at least modifying some of what Thales had to say. But the direction in which he went was very, very interesting. Now, I don't want to repeat necessarily all the things that I had to say about trying to enter into his imaginative horizon, what polytheism was like, how it is that we're moving in the direction of monotheism. So all of that is in the material on Thales. So if you haven't seen that yet, check out the material on Thales and then come back to Anaximander, since he was his kind of natural, intellectual, and then even historical successor. So that being said, building from Thales, the reason that Anaximander is so interesting and has been so interesting to scholars is because even though we have virtually no writing from him, I mean, we only have like maybe one complete sentence and a few more words. I mean, it's really almost nothing. But the reason that he's so interesting is because Anaximander proposes the Apeiron. And the Apeiron as a word means boundless, so not having limits, the indefinite, or maybe infinite, the infinite. But to say that it's the infinite is to conflate it with a lot of theology and a lot of thinking that was going on much, much later. And so it's interesting to know that you can translate it that way, but I prefer thinking about it as the boundless. And that's a fairly straightforward translation of the word itself, a fairly straightforward literal translation of the word itself. So the Apeiron is the boundless. Now, why is this interesting, though? Why is this different than Thales? So Apeiron as a term, as an idea, is proposed as the kind of origin of all things, as the first principle. And we're told, again, by Theophrastus that he may have been the first to use the term arche. And arche refers to a first principle. This is what Aristotle was thinking when he was thinking about the Presocratics. He thought about them in terms of what were the first principles. How do we get down to the bedrock of what is the most basic understanding that you can have of what something is? And Aristotle thought of this in terms of its first principles. So its nature. What was its essence? He's trying to get to what the thing is. And what Anaximander has to say is that the origin of all things is in the Apeiron, in the boundless. Well, that's actually very interesting because with Thales, we get all is water, and that water is the kind of guiding principle. He doesn't say arche, again, check out the material on Thales. He doesn't say arche, but it's headed in that direction. With Anaximander, we have this Apeiron, which is apparently a very abstract notion. And that's what makes it very interesting, is that it's not a physical thing. So with water, we can kind of point to an element. We can point, even though we weren't going to get the elements in their traditional form of, the four elements and the way that we typically think about things with the ancient world. We don't get that until much later. But nevertheless, the Apeiron is clearly not a physical thing. It is an indefinite. It is precisely something that is before it has an essence, before it has any kind of form. So one way of thinking about the Apeiron is in terms of what does not yet have a nature. And so it is what happens. So this is like the all-consuming chaos, the all-consuming indefinite, before anything is given a specific nature and becomes the kind of thing that it is. Now, if that's not clear, let's try and stretch this out and understand it a little bit more. Metaphysics, trying to think about, okay, what are the basic constituents of reality? What is reality? That is the guiding question of metaphysics. And metaphysics is, what is our understanding of what reality is? What is, in general? What does it mean for something to be? Well, for something to be, it must be the thing that it is and not other things. In other words, we must be able to differentiate things from one another. Well, on what basis might we actually be able to differentiate things? Well, it seems like things are different. It seems like they have different natures. Well, how deep does that go? How far down does that go? Does it go all the way to their creation, their coming to be itself? And so these are the stories that we get. And Anaximander's story kind of builds upon what it is that we see from the ancient Greeks around this time, and what we would see very similarly in Hebrew cosmology. And so there we have this, God moved across the waters and the chaos. In other words, all was empty and without form. God moved across the waters, and then you had this kind of creation. Well, water is in itself an indefinite principle. Water can take on any form. I can pour it into a glass and it retains the form of that glass. I can, hold it in my hands and it conforms to the shape of my hands. And it's a universal solvent, which is something they would have noticed, that you can use water to clean things and it tends to dissolve things and change everything. And so water as a first principle of the entire world, insofar as it has those properties and seems to be not bound to any one nature, but can take on the form of lots of different things, that makes it a reasonable candidate for underpinning all of reality. That maybe everything is just water taking on more and more definite forms. That's not a terrible way of thinking about the human body, as water having taken on a more definite form. We are still largely liquid, and it so happens to be mostly water. And so that's just, kind of chemically, that's the way that we understand things now. But what I'm saying is that the metaphysics, the ancient metaphysics, would have not been that far from what would come to be our physical theory in that way, such that water as a generative principle could have been understood as the sort of thing that created or was responsible for, was at the bedrock of natures of different kinds. The nature of a fish, the nature of a cloud, let's say, which nature of a cloud as water, hey, the nature of air, the nature, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one way of thinking about this. Well, water is something definite. The Apeiron is the indefinite. And so this is to take things even one step further back in terms of abstraction. Now, increasing abstraction is one way of thinking about what monotheism actually is. In other words, monotheism itself can be understood as an attempt to step back in abstraction from all of the different gods. The gods can be understood as all the different forces of reality in terms of love and hate and memory and sleep and childbearing and trees and rocks and bears and lions and tigers and etc. All of those things may be said to have their own natures, but it might be that they all share a common nature. And if we step back to what being is in general, okay, well, maybe we have hit the ultimate abstraction in terms of this is the one category, this is the one thing that underpins all of what reality is. And that's where we get something like monotheism. And so God as being itself, that's what we get in Hebrew mythology. And so in Exodus 3:14, that's what we hear. God is he who is. I am he who is. That's one of the names of God, is to be identified with being. And this is the direction that things were headed in the actual axial age. That is, in the first millennium BC, when we saw all these transformations going from polytheism to what we would recognize as monotheism. That transformation included changes that can be understood, at least, in terms of increasing abstraction. And so as we increase our abstraction and we take steps back further and further, well, there's a step beyond which you can't go. And that's when you've subsumed all possible reality. So everything in reality has been included in this monos, has been included in a single one, a hen. In other words, this is the one, like henotheism. So once you have been included in a single unity, a single divine unity, then you have monotheism. Well, Anaximander's Apeiron is a kind of monotheism in that way, in that it is indefinite. It is before the possibility of any given nature. In other words, any specific nature is going to be something that is posterior to the Apeiron. So you have the indefinite stuff, kind of like a lump of clay that you haven't made anything out of it yet, but as you give it definite form, then it becomes a cartoon character, or it becomes a ball, or it becomes a, whatever it is that you're making. And that's the kind of thing, and that's the metaphor that we get, indeed, of the creation of humanity. Humans being made out of clay, or things being made out of whatever the primordial stuff was. And that primordial stuff was indefinite, in other words, without form. It is boundless. It is the Apeiron. And so this is, I think, a much more useful way of talking about and understanding and getting our heads into that space of understanding why Anaximander's change was so important. Because he was moving from something like water, which is itself indefinite but still physical, to something that was clearly just not physical. You don't ever see the Apeiron on its own. You only see individual manifestations of things. And now we're getting closer to Plato and what we would see with Socrates and Plato in the succeeding generations. So I think that's useful. Now, let's take a look at the material that we actually have from Anaximander. And I'm going to read to you all of his collected works because we've got, like I said, a sentence and a half. So there's almost nothing. So this is the famous bit. The non-limited, the Apeiron, is the original material of existing things. Further, the source from which existing things derive their existence is also that to which they return at their destruction, according to necessity. For they give justice and make reparation to one another for their injustice according to the arrangement of time. Now, this is Kathleen Freeman's translation of Diels. Diels is the sort of, okay, I'm going to take all the stuff in the Presocratics, put it together. It ended up in German. Kathleen Freeman translates the material that was assembled there from the original Greek into English. And so anyway, that's one possible translation of that. Now, I want to dive into detail with that, but let me read you the other bits because it's very quick. Here's one of the others. This essential nature, whatever it is, of the non-limited, so this is everlasting and ageless. So the Apeiron is everlasting and ageless. In other words, it is eternal and it does not age. It does not change. It does not decay, or it's not subject to corruption in the way that ephemeral living things are here and now. And then we also have another one which is curious, nozzle of the bellows. So, a pump, the bellows, and then you've got the nozzle of it. Who knows? And then the earth is like a stone column, which is part of how he understood the world as being this kind of flat thing, extended down, extruded like a circle would be into a column, and then with space and whatnot around it. And so there's a lot that can be said, for instance, about the way that he understood the world physically, how the stars were just kind of, you had this ring of fire and these little holes that were poked through. And if you take a blanket and you poke holes in it, and then you shine a light on the other side of the blanket, and we hear this with Incubus's song, right? I mean, if you're familiar with that, this is straight back to Anaximander. But Anaximander thought of it in terms of fire, of course, because flashlights, you don't really have that. So light, you have fire, and the fire can be seen through those holes that are poked in there, and that's what the stars are. Anyway, so that's kind of fun. Now, let's dive into the one statement, as I said, that is pregnant with meaning that we have from Anaximander, the much discussed sentence. So the Apeiron is the original material of existing things. This is why Aristotle regarded it as a kind of arche, and this is why it's possible that he was the first to use the term arche in this way in referring to a first principle of what things are. So the Apeiron is the original material of existing things. Further, it's the source from which existing things derive their existence. In other words, the Apeiron is the source of existence itself. Anything that exists because of the Apeiron. And anything that is created and comes to be, so it emerges from the Apeiron and comes to be and take on definite form in life. And we picture like an acorn growing into an oak tree, a baby growing into a person. That is returned to the Apeiron upon its destruction. So upon its corruption and decay, its aging and death, it returns to the indefinite. The indefinite is changeless. It is everlasting and ageless. Out of the indefinite, we get the emergence of particular forms. Those particular forms are temporary, ephemeral. They change, they corrupt, they decay, and then they return to the indefinite. And so you have this kind of emergence and decay phenomenon going on. Well, that points to, and I tried to use the language that would be indicative of what it is that we will later see in Neoplatonism, because ultimately that's the direction that things are headed, and that's the kind of way that we come to think about these things. It's also, by the way, the kind of thing that we're going to hear with Origen in the early centuries of Christianity with his apokatastasis, the return of things to God, the return of all things to God, which turned out to be a much discussed idea in Christian history. Okay, so everything returns, so it emanates, Neoplatonic emanation, the exodus, and then the reditus, the return to upon its destruction, in other words, losing its definite form. And that's ultimately how this is understood, is that, I mean, we understand things in the same way, right? The atoms and the molecules and whatnot are not actually destroyed. They're just returning to a less organized form. So you have the order that emerges, and then it goes back into disorder. It goes back into an indefinite form, the Apeiron. And this happens according to necessity. And so that invites a lot of other thinking in terms of, okay, well, what does he actually mean by necessity? He could not have meant a kind of syllogistic necessity, which is what we get from Aristotle, because Aristotle is the first to really do that kind of formal logic. So he couldn't have had that in mind. But how did he understand necessity? And then he goes on and says, for they give justice and make reparation to one another. They pay their debts to one another, according to the injustice, according to the dispensation, the judgment and arrangement of time. The word arrangement here is not great. So this is referring to the kind of decision that a judge might make. And so a judge might say that, you know, this is the appropriate retribution that you pay to the person that you have wronged. And he thought about this, and this is couched in terms of the language of debt. And that, I think, is really very interesting, because debt, if you're familiar with, and I know if you've seen some of what else I've had to say on similar topics, then you'll know that I like David Graeber's work. And so Graeber has a history of debt. He has a book called Debt, the First 5,000 Years. And so this is an interesting chronicle. It's something that really you don't have in the same way before you get to larger and advanced societies. You do have a notion of, okay, well, you've done something for me, I should do something for you. And this is kind of basic with respect to reciprocity. And I'm thinking, of course, of, Marcel Mauss here in The Gift, essay on the gift in the early 20th century, which is very well known in anthropological circles. But really the emergence of the idea of debt, and especially the idea that the gods themselves should have something to do with debt, and that debt is somehow deep into the metaphysics of what it means to be at all. That's a new thing, and that's really kind of curious, and it involves debt at rather fundamental levels, which we should, I think seriously about, and not just take as a given of the way that things have to be. And so again, this invites us to think in terms of debt, and we're told here that the judge in this situation is time. Now that's curious, that the judge is time, that time necessarily provides this sort of reparation and judgment and motion. In other words, time in some way governs this motion of emanation and return, which of course it happens over time. Time would be the most basic requirement for that kind of thing to happen, because it is necessarily a temporal relation. So that makes it a really, really interesting thing to say about that dynamic, that it must happen in time. And of course, the Apeiron, we are told, is ageless and everlasting. In other words, it happens outside of time. And this is very much the same way that God is understood in terms of monotheism of the Hebrews in Judaism, and then also in Christian circles as well. God would be understood as outside of time, as eternal, and all things owing their existence to God. I mean, you see, it's a very similar sort of idea when it's couched in those terms, and this is during the time that we see the emergence of that kind of worldview, of that kind of perspective coming in the middle of the axial age. So I hope that's helpful in understanding Anaximander. Now, I want to tell you a couple of stories as well, just to kind of round things out with our discussion of Anaximander that you may have heard. So Anaximander is well known for being a cartographer, and so he was said to have produced apparently an accurate, useful, or at least interesting map of the Aegean and of the known world at that time. And so he drew, the kind of coastlines. So he's well known for that, and that is a testament to the kind of precision and interest and way of thinking about things. So it's meant to be perhaps emblematic of what it is that he would have done, even if in fact that's not something that he actually did. Who knows? So that's interesting. The other is that we're told that Anaximander may have proposed infinite worlds, that there are many different possible worlds, and there's the question of, are they happening all at the same time, or is it this also kind of yo-yo motion where you have the emanation, the creation of a world, and then it falls back into the indefinite only to be created again? And is this the, kind of long year cycle of creation and destruction of the entire world that we hear about, for instance, in Hinduism? Who knows? It's not even clear that this is able to be straightforwardly attributed to Anaximander. We don't have enough evidence to try and determine what it is that he might have thought about this, whether he proposed the idea at all, and then further than that, whether he thought about them as happening concurrently as, multiple universes in the way that we hear about in physics now, or of successive universes where you have creation and destruction. So the Big Bang, the Big Contraction, Big Bang, who knows? We don't know. People like talking about this, perhaps, if nothing else, because they can understand it. And the other aspects of Anaximander and the Apeiron, I think, are much more philosophically interesting, historically substantive, but they're also considerably harder to understand. So I hope that this helps in thinking about Anaximander.